Hanny here. Today we're going to continue with the big ideas of biology. Also, this theme is a lot of characteristics of life on sections 3 and 4 of chapter 1. Okay, starting section 3, it continues with big idea number 2, which deals with energy and the building blocks of living things. Now you might remember talking about this idea in chemistry of entropy, or in Bio 2 or Bio 1. Okay, entropy is this tendency towards disorderness, towards randomness. And in order to combat entropy, because life is complex, things tend to break down. And so in order to stay highly organized, there has to be a constant input of energy. Okay, energy is the ability to do work. It's required to maintain that high organization and conduct certain processes, certain chemical reactions that the living thing needs to stay alive. Okay, term we've used a lot before, and we'll hit over and over and over again. The sum of all of those chemical reactions, those life-sustaining reactions in a living thing, is called metabolism. Okay, the sun, remember, we talked about Bio 2, is the ultimate source of energy. Okay, so that if our sun would burn out, eventually we would, because of entropy, we would lose all that energy, and we'll take a look at that here in a second. Okay, the energy from the sun is harnessed, remember, through photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is taking that solar energy and then taking electrons from the splitting of water, and we'll get into that more again this year, and putting it together, taking low energy things like water and carbon dioxide, putting in the solar energy and storing it as a high energy sugar or carbohydrate. Then those can be stored and then used and broken down later on the reverse process. Those carbohydrates can be broken down then in cellular respiration to release that energy, usually in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is then used to power processes in our cell. When we look at the living things and their relationship to the non-living environment, okay, we call that ecology, or ecosystems are the living things and then the environment, the physical place that they're at. Now notice between the actual physical chemicals and the energy, they do two different things. And we talked about this in biology too. Chemicals will cycle. So we talked about the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle. The actual elements will cycle between living and non-living. Remember, sink, reservoir, and exchange pool. Okay? Energy will flow. So chemicals will cycle, whereas energy will flow. Okay? And it'll flow one way, and eventually then, remember, from sun through the ecosystem, and then it's eventually lost as non-useful energy. Chemicals move from one population to another. One thing eats another thing, or a plant using nutrients out of the ground or carbon dioxide out of the air, and it builds it into the tissues. Eventually you get death and decomposition, where they're put back into the air, back into the soil, and it starts all over again. Remember, energy from the sun comes in through photosynthesis, and then as cellular respiration, and we use that ATP. Remember, the laws of thermodynamics say that some of that useful energy is lost as heat, and that heat eventually escapes into the atmosphere, and then eventually into space. And remember, space can hold a lot of heat. Okay, so it's lost. So the sun has to keep inputting energy because it flows one way and then leaves. The chemicals can just keep cycling. Okay, this is just kind of a visual representation of that. Okay, here's our solar energy up here. So energy comes in through the producers, photosynthesis, goes through the food chains, decomposers, and then all along the way, you see heat, 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 heat. Okay, this stuff then is given off and it goes out into space and it's lost forever. Okay, whereas chemicals, you see the chemicals are taken out of, and we should actually put air here as well. Okay, from the air and the soil, and they're taken in early on in the food chain and the food webs, and then it cycles through the consumers, the decomposers, and then it's put back into the soil or back into the air. And so we get this round and round, and we get the cycling. So this is just kind of a visual of what we talked about on the last slide. When it comes to energy and nutrients, remember there's this idea of homeostasis, which we've talked about before, this internal balance, keeping things within certain boundaries. So when we talk about a human, we're talking about your body temperature, acidity of your blood, fluid balance, calcium levels in your blood. Okay, there's this homeostasis. It's imperative, very important that an organism maintain that state of balance. And feedback systems we have, and plants have, and other organisms have, used to monitor those internal conditions, and then they will make adjustments as things kind of get out of whack. Okay, section 4, big idea 3, information storage, transmission, and response. Living things store, share, respond to the information. Basically, we're talking genetics here, genetics and reproduction. Okay, living organisms use information in a variety of ways. Chemical signals that are used to communicate. This year we'll talk about cell signaling. This will include things like hormones and ligands that are used for organs to communicate besides just your nerve impulses. And then also information storage. Your DNA, RNA, those kind of things like that have the actual code, the recipes for building and making and doing all the things that the living thing needs to do. The success of the individual organism and the populations depend on their ability to store this information, store what they need, and then to respond to things in their environment and in order to be able to survive. Now, in order for that living thing and those populations to continue, obviously they must reproduce. The manner of reproduction varies. There's sexual reproduction, asexual reproduction, and then some kind of in-betweens and some varying, and some can do either or. And then what they're trying to do is pass their genetic information on to the next generation. It determines their characteristics, obviously made up of DNA. With asexual reproduction, they're going to be genetically identical. Okay, if a bacterium splits into two bacterium to two daughter cells, they're going to be exactly the same. Whereas with sexual, where you have a plus and minus strain or a male and female, this is going to help maintain genetic diversity. Okay, because you're kind of reshuffling the deck of the genes that are in that population. And it's going to reshuffle those genes for the offspring are going to be a mix of mom and dad. And finally, living things need to respond. They respond to their environment. They respond to stimuli. Stimuli are things in the environment. One of the first labs we'll do here this year is look at pill bugs and how animal responses and how they respond to each other, and also crickets. How do crickets respond to each other, to males, males to females? There are interactions that take place. And oftentimes we just think of like animals, but also remember plants and all living things have the ability to respond. Later this year, when we talk about plants, one that we talk about here are tropisms. This would be phototropism, okay, where the plant is growing towards the window, growing towards light. And you've got gravitropism, so that the roots grow down and the shoots go up. Thigmotropism, vines and stuff that will respond to touch and will curl around something in order to kind of vine up and hang on. So remember, response to stimuli is not just like animals chasing prey or running from predators or going towards good environments, damp or dry or light or dark, but also plants, fungi, those kind of things will respond to their environment as well. And finally, kind of along the evolution route, is this idea that things adapt to their environment. And adaptation is a modification that makes an organism better able to survive in the environment. And remember, most adaptations or modifications or changes come because of changes in that genetic material or mutations. Okay, that's the raw material for evolution to occur. The diversity of life exists over long periods of time. Organisms respond to changing environments by developing new adaptations. Organisms that are very, very well adapted to a very specific habitat have a really hard time if their environment changes too fast. What do we see? They often will go extinct, especially with human influence. Humans move into an area and rapidly change it. Whereas things that are more generally adapted, things like rats and pigeons and cockroaches, they will survive in human environments and greatly changing environments because they're not as specifically adapted to really specific needs. And as we track these things over time, through evolutionary time, we see shifts in gene pools, and in characteristics as things change and become more suited to environments and as environments change.